It looks now as if my mother will live to see her 91st birthday a few weeks from now. A few weeks ago, she fell at home. My sister, who looks in on her and checks up with her continually, found her at her condominium in the bathroom on the floor, unconscious. She'd been there for a while. She was all battered, all bruised, disoriented. My sister phoned for the ambulance. The ambulance came and took my mother straight to the hospital. And she spent a week or more at the hospital. The doctor said that she had broken several ribs, had bruised her sternum, and she had contusions all over her face and arms. She'd also done further damage to her lower back. For a time, my sister and I thought, and I'm not being melodramatic, that we'd lose her. It was that bad. She was that weak. But thanks be to God, after a period in the hospital and after a couple of weeks at a skilled nursing facility, my mother has gotten her strength back and she is recovering. And God willing, she'll get to go home, though she'll need some help while she's at home. We all know about weaknesses, don't we? You and I. We've taken a fall. I know some of you have. We've gotten sick, perhaps even seriously sick, perhaps even terminally ill. We've lost a job. Maybe we've lost a home. We've declared bankruptcy. We've just lost a loved one. We've maybe lost a marriage. We might even have lost our faith in God for a time. Know this, though, in our weakness, we have excellent company. We have the very best company. Jesus, who is God with us full time, if you will, knows weakness himself. Not secondhand, but from his own experience, from the inside out, you might say. Jesus is divine. We believe that as Christians. We affirm that in the creed. But he is also human, and so we affirm. Human in every way except in sin, except in the rejection of God. His own people, his own hometown, they reject him. He knows what it's like to feel that rejection. They reject him, they reject his mission, his purpose in the world, which is salvation. They discount him. Oh, he's just the carpenter's son, they say. His friends betray him, his friends abandon him. He suffers through that horrible passion of his. He dies on the cross, not an easy death, but a grueling, long death, all because of love. All because he loves us. All because he loves us so much that he will suffer and die for us in order that we would not suffer and die eternally. In order that we always would be in fellowship with God, no matter what. Yes, Jesus knows weakness from the inside out. And so too does the Apostle Paul. In the epistle today, Paul writes to the church at Corinth, this church which is beset with strife. He's being attacked personally as a false apostle, as a heretic. He's not, people are saying, he's not as gifted as those super apostles, those apostles who are people of razzle-dazzle. He's not like them. Paul acknowledges his weakness. He writes that he's endured weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, not for the sake of his ego, but for the sake of Christ. For the sake of Christ and his mission of proclaiming the good news of God's love to one and all. And on top of all of that, we hear today in the epistle, Paul has this mysterious thorn in the flesh. Now, maybe it's the Corinthians themselves. I don't know. Or maybe it is a physical ailment. Scholars don't know. But whatever it is, it has sent Paul to his knees continually, asking to be delivered from this thorn. You know something about that, I suspect. Maybe even right now, there's a thorn in your flesh. Now, in his weakness, notice what Paul does. Does Paul give up on God? Does Paul walk away? Does Paul say, God really doesn't exist? He doesn't. Paul, in his weakness, he turns to God. He turns to that reliable and that only source of true power, of supernatural strength, of grace. Paul turns to God because only God can deliver the Apostle Paul, just as only God can deliver us. I imagine the Apostle crying out in prayer, God help me, God save me, God deliver me. Again and again I hear him cry out those words, that prayer, that simple prayer. And God responds. God says, my grace is sufficient for you. For power is made perfect in weakness. And so I will boast, the apostle says. I will boast gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content. Content with weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Last week I spoke with a friend of mine, a friend who is a faithful Christian, a friend who is a deeply spiritual person, a friend who, despite all of that, nevertheless is going through a time of deep suffering. Her terminally ill husband had spent weeks in the intensive care unit at the hospital. And during those weeks she prayed and she prayed and others prayed and prayed. And God answered her prayer and our prayers. God made it possible for her husband to go home, to spend his last days there with her, with other family members, with friends, in the comfort, in the security, in the familiarity of their home. And it was there that she spent those last minutes with her husband at his bedside. She sat there, she told me, beside him, watching him breathe. Each breath, between each breath, there was a longer and longer and longer period. Now, I have sat with many dying people, including my own father. And you have sat with many dying people, I'm sure. And you know exactly what this friend of mine was experiencing. She thought each breath would be his last. And yet there would be another, and another, and another, until there weren't any more breaths. He was still. He had died. She said seconds after his death, she didn't use these words, but they're my words. She had one of these, call it Pauline experiences, the kind of experience we hear the apostle write about in the epistle today. How she was, as it were, raptured into the third heaven. He experienced the third heaven, and she experienced that third heaven. She said, I quote, "It was as if the veil had been lifted, and I caught a glimpse of heaven. I felt a lightness of being." She said that again and again. A lightness of being. Nothing was weighing me down anymore. The burden had been lifted, and there was this lightness of being. And I knew, she said, I knew that he was well. I knew that all things, in all ways, would be well. My friend was expressing that experience of God's strength in her time of greatest weakness. Now, we're all weak at times, maybe even right now. We can give up on God. We can turn to God. We can turn to God in faith, as Jesus is urging those who are listening to his proclamation in this gospel today. We can turn to God in faith, as David himself turned to God in faith. And we can find that power, that supernatural strength that will surge within us. And it will enable us to carry on. And as the Apostle Paul says elsewhere, God's grace will give us the strength to bear that weakness, to live with that thorn in the side, or God's grace will take away that thorn. But whatever God does, God gives us his grace in that time of weakness, that surging strength from on high, if you will. And we will know for ourselves what my friend knew, what the Apostle Paul knew, what Jesus knew, even on the cross as the angels ministered to him in that time of great suffering. We will know, my grace is sufficient for you. For power is made perfect in weakness. Amen.